it's important to talk some more about this idea of the conscious mind, which obviously is no quick conversation. One simple way to describe the conscious mind versus the ego mind, as far as how they function, is that the ego mind does subject-object perception, and the view from the ego mind is from a point out towards an object. And of course, the ego mind can project, and it can narcissistically include, and all these different things. But generally speaking, there's this dualistic setup. And again, the origin, the awareness from is from this idea of a point, whereas the conscious mind holds a space. The conscious mind doesn't do a point A to point B kind of thing. The way I understand and experience, it literally creates a space. Let's just say three-dimensional space-time. If we say that's a box, right? That's a matrix. That's this finite thing, right? And the soul realm is outside of that. It's out beyond that. So an individual soul can presence itself within that 3D space-time box. It exists beyond it, but it can come into it, so to speak. And it does that via ontological structures. So the soul is one of those ontological structures, and then the soul has within it various other ontological structures. So the conscious mind being the primary one. The conscious mind is like this tool that can then create conscious space for various objects in three-dimensional space-time.
Say that part one more time. It's consciousness's like entrance point to provide space. Like there has to be some organ of consciousness to create space for something in the same realm that ego perception exists.
Yeah, so it's analogous to light, right? If the ego realm is innately dark, but the conscious mind can shine light on it, so it illuminates. But what I'm getting at is, so to witness is to shine light on, so to speak. To hold is to provide a space, because in addition to just shining light, there's this idea of space, this idea of conscious space. It's like we don't realize how bound we are to structures, how bound we are in our perspectives. The ego lives in this matrix that has these certain dimensions and these certain laws that go with each dimension. And the conscious mind brings in this consciousness that creates this conscious space that has a whole different set of laws. So, for example, the analogy is like an ice cube versus water or versus gas. It's like, well, the ice cube is crystallized into this rigid form, and if all you knew was the ice cube, it's like there isn't even conceiving of the possibility of those molecules having the freedom to move around the way they can in a gas, because there's this literal shift that happens, right, to go from solid to liquid to gas. It's like the conscious mind comes in and it literally creates a space for the ego realm material, if you will, to move in a way that it can't when it doesn't have that space. So we're locked into programs, locked into rigid frameworks when we are absent conscious space. So creativity, spontaneity, originality, etc., just can't happen. That's something that originates out of consciousness.
Consciousness is coming in via witnessing and shining light. It's also coming in via holding and providing space. But in both instances, it's using the knowledge of something outside of that space and time. That the context, like you're saying, of being frozen, of being an ice block on its own, can never see to moving beyond that. But consciousness can shine light on that condition and provide space for it to see that there is something outside of itself. at least as far as initially being held in a way that it didn't feel was possible before.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, like with the ice metaphor, I mean, consciousness melts, right? Like there's...
Yeah, it deconstructs.
Yeah.
Not absolutely. It doesn't,
But melting isn't absolute, right? Melting is just changing state.
It is, but it's not like if you bring in consciousness, you're just going to end up being a pile of mush.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You're not just like aiming a heat beam around and you're just...
Right. Yeah, and that gets more into this idea of ideal blueprint.
Right.
Where consciousness somehow restores an original blueprint.
Right.
It clears away distortion.
We'll have to come back to that because I think I'm sure that's a question people have, is like, what is the ends in mind of consciousness, right? Like what is...
Yeah.
Which I know is probably in the end not going to be that satisfying an answer, but it's still a good point to make.
Right. This idea of conscious space, it's a really hard... It was a big deal for me when I started seeing it this way. A lot of things started to make sense. It's the same kind of thing when you talk about an inner self or an inner dimension to experience or one's interior. It's like, well, it doesn't mean some point in the center of your body, right? When you say interior, it doesn't mean, in your chest cavity. Or the idea is it's literally a dimension. It's like when you think about that, an inner dimension, it's like, okay, well, as far as the physics of that, it's like, well, there's this idea that if you keep going inward, it's like, well, seems like you would reach some finite point, right? But then the idea is that point is actually a portal into some other space.
Right.
And then that idea that if you actually go through that point, where you come out, so to speak, is all around the point. This happens a lot with clients where in the work we're doing, there'll be a state shift and their perspective shifts where suddenly, for example, right now when you look around, right now from an ego, three-dimensional ego perspective, there's you, meaning your body, your mind, sitting in that room, and that room is all around you, right? So you're a thing surrounded by a room. But when you shift into a conscious perspective, that room is in your consciousness. So who's holding who? The room is bigger than your body, but your conscious mind is bigger than the room, which is a strange thing. Because there's a power in that, right? When I say, okay, who's holding whom or who's bigger, right? If we use the word bigger, if bigger is better, it's like, well, that room might be able to bully you, but you can bully the room, right? You're bigger than the room.
Right.
And what I mean by that is to the extent that we feel threat, right? Disempowerment, disconnection, this perspective of being this small thing looking out at a huge world. I mean, it's like we just don't stand a chance, even on a physical level, it's like you cannot ensure your safety, no matter how how buff you get or how much martial arts you do or how good you get with a gun. Like you're outmatched by the physical universe, right? There's no way to take it on. And there's that idea that, that we can't face the reality of our situation as egos. It's too overwhelming. It's too scary. It's too tragic. And it literally, the idea is from the ego perspective, you have to defend, you have to project in the same way that they say, well, the child's so dependent on the parent that they cannot experience themselves as separate from the parent yet, right? Until they get to a certain developmental phase. And then it's the step-by-step process. And the general idea is none of us ever complete it. We're all still attached to our parents in a way that's like this false dependent identification. And the idea is that as adults, we're still doing that in this massive way. We can't really look out at the the truth of the whole thing. And so it's like, okay, there's truth to that, but then it's only overwhelming to the extent that you're identifying from that perspective. And the question is, okay, what enables you to to kind of go on anyway, right? What enables you, aside from psychological defense? It's like, how can we face our predicament here? And the general idea is, well, there, to varying degrees, we are connected to, we are conscious of, let's just say, the soul realm. And so it's really by that we carry on, right? It's really that sustains us. You know, there's the Christian, the story in the Bible where there's the footprints in the sand, and, you know, through the really rough patch, there's only one set of footprints.
I'm familiar.
Okay. And so that, you know, that idea that it's like, it's not your ego that's doing this, right? It's your soul that's carrying you through, even though the ego thinks it's doing it. And there's even that thing where, you know, the ego takes credit for everything. It's like you learn to ride a bike, and then the ego mind goes, oh, I figured it out. And it's like, no, your body figured it out. These various processes and mechanisms in your body figured it out. It wasn't a cognitive exercise. It was by way of trial and error and of feeling it out, and these various learning and structuring mechanisms that happen. And then eventually the ego's like, so here's how I did that, you know. And
that's trippy. That's I hadn't thought about it that way.
Right. It just co-ops everything in for better or for worse, right? Because it also feels responsible for everything. So then it's like ashamed, you know, and it's like your body is what it is. It's like you do all this stuff, you know, you have these bodily processes, and then the ego mind's like ashamed of it, you know. It's like such a weird predicament. I mean, you know, and then that idea of, oh, I love my body, or I hate my body, or I think my body's good, or oh my God, I'm sorry that I passed gas, or I feel so ashamed that I feel horny for something that I shouldn't feel horny for. Just this crazy situation that we're in.
Just along for the ride for every part of it.
Yeah. So, you know, just like the body from below, it's like, okay, the soul from above is really doing a lot more than the ego mind gives it credit for. If you just look through the ego lens, again, you're in a predicament, right? You're trapped in various ways, and worse than that, there seems to be in the ego mind itself. It's not only trapped as far as its ability to perceive, but there seems to be these innate characteristics of it. One of them being this desire for death, this move towards death, this destructiveness, this death drive, if you will. And so what I'm saying is if not for the consciousness, then that's what you end up with, right? And so to the extent that there's separation from consciousness, we get all these, you know, what we tend to think of as evil or as suffering. So I'm just trying to set up this model of like our vision is dependent on light. When you turn the light out, we're screwed, you know? When it's dark, we don't do very well as far as navigating by our eyes. We need light in order to function. And so I'm saying it's the same with the conscious mind. Without the conscious mind illuminating our experience for us, we're just groping around in the dark. And so I'm saying the conscious mind not only functions like a little, what do they call those little lights? Like a
headlamp?
Yeah, a headlamp. There's a certain way it functions like a headlamp. So if you wander into a dark cave of the ego with your conscious mind, you're going in there with a headlamp, which is very different than if you're wandering in there without one. But not only does it shine, like a headlamp shines from a point out into space, right? But the conscious mind holds a space and sort of shines light into that space.
It's not just an illuminated ego.
No.
There's a different aspect to the light, and that's the distinction you're making.
Right.
What I think has been helpful so far, because you started with, you know, to witness is to shine light on, to hold is provide a space. And then, so we're kind of coming back to that now in the context of light in a cave, the headlamp. I think it's all okay. I think that distinction you're making is still pretty nuanced as far as like what does a field of light or a space of light created by conscious mind like? I think describing the experience of it will help clear up what you mean.
I got to say this part first. I think I've said this before on the podcast, but and again, these claims I'm making, or I should say, I'm not trying to make a claim. I'm just presenting an idea. We tend to think of the universe as this infinite black space that contains within it these stars that shine light, that radiate light outward, right? It's like we think of the black space as primary and then these stars kind of as secondary to that. But if you think of, okay, if the stars are actually like windows out into the soul realm, that the universe is actually in the soul realm. It's a object, if you will, that exists in the soul realm, right? So similar to in your room, if your room is the universe, but then you open a window and this light shines in, but if you had no awareness of out beyond your room, you'd experience it different, right? But you know better than that. So you know that, okay, that's actually light coming in through this portal, this opening in the wall. And the light that just is existing out there is shining into your room. And if you think of, okay, there's the universe and it's dark, just like a room is dark, but then the stars are actually these windows from the soul realm shining into this three-dimensional universe. So it flips it, right? It makes the light primary and the space secondary. And then in addition to that, there's this idea that when light expands, so to speak, right? It has this radiating, expansive movement to it. When the star shines, that's actually creating the space. So it's like blowing up a balloon. Before you blow into the balloon, there's not the space, right? But you blow into the balloon and the air expands that balloon out, and now you have all this space in this balloon. And the idea is that the light is shining into the universe and blowing it up, creating space, expanding it. And you can talk about the three-dimensional universe, but if you consider that there's infinite dimensions, each of these little conscious points blow up the dimension. They expand it, they create it. The truth is the light. Space is created. So if you take this analogy, if you say that the truth is that the sun is shining, but you may have your window closed, so you may be experiencing darkness, right? But then there can be all these layers. It's like, well, if you say, no, Lance, I think the sun went out, and it's like, well, Jeff, actually, your eyelids are closed. Like, open your eyes. You open your eyes. Nope, it's still dark. It's like, well, your window's closed. Open the window. Okay. Nope, it's still dark. It's like, well, it's super cloudy outside. Or it could even be, well, it's 12 o'clock at night. Like this, you could think the sun has ceased to exist, or the sun burned out, or the sun died, or something. It's like, no, it didn't. The truth is the sun is shining. It's just you're experiencing darkness based on whatever structures are in the way. So this idea that our conscious mind is like the sun, right? Or it's like a star. It shines, it can create space, but there can also be all these things that can block it. And if we lose touch, we can think that darkness is the truth, or that it's primary, or that it's, absolute. And it's like, no, that's just a phenomenon, actually. That's not ontology. So again, back to this idea of, okay, living in three-dimensional space-time, living in physical bodies, being trapped in ego minds, etc., we're very, very separated out from source, right? Separated out from God, separated out from our own souls. Having this experience that's very dark, very limited, very filled with shadows. And the spiritual idea is, okay, for example, to have spiritual faith is to, even though you're in the darkness, to believe, for example, that that's not the total truth, though, that there is light, that it's not just, that reality isn't just dark. But then the idea of spiritual awakening is that you literally get more in touch with the light. It's not just a belief. It's not just faith. It's not just hoping. It's, oh, no, you actually managed to get a window open, and you actually have an experience of direct access to light. And so realization of one's conscious mind to whatever degree literally puts one in more directly in touch with soul, with spirit, with God, with something, whatever you want to call it, that seems to be beyond this ego predicament. And then, in addition to the awakening aspect of it, and that's where it's like, okay, but what about healing? What about growth, development? What about performance? It's like, oh, that conscious mind that is taking light from the soul realm, through it, so to speak, can then shine it like a headlamp into various dimensions of the ego and illuminate it. But not only does it shine it like a headlamp, but it puts, this is that dimension thing where if you're stuck looking through a tube, then there's that fixed perspective, right? But if you're not aware you're looking through a tube, right? Or it's like that example of the elephant and the various people all, feeling their way around a different part of the elephant. And so they each think, they know what an elephant is, but we have this ability to stand back and look with our eyes and walk around. And so we can create this experience of an elephant that's much more complex and multidimensional than the person who is just feeling with their hands a certain part of the elephant. So same idea. If you're looking through a tube, but you don't know it, and then if I can come in and pull you out of that perspective through the tube and help you back out and see in a way that's a much larger scope. It's like that. It's like the conscious mind holds a space, and now suddenly the experience of what's going on in that space changes because now it brings in way more freedom, way more possibility, way more potentiality. And so the structuring is no longer crystallized.
That's the opportunity of conscious holding.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like if the paper tube, if you think that you take the paper tube down, you'll go blind.
Yeah.
Like you'll never take the tube down.
Yeah, right.
If like that, your monocular perspective, this tiny window into everything around you seems like the only source of light, the only source of space or anything. Like you're not going to let go of that.
Exactly. Yeah, it seems like death to do that.
Right. And that's how important those defenses are too. I mean, that's what is seemingly keeping you afloat in the vast universe that can crush you in every conceivable way.
Yeah.
But to provide holding, even if, let's say, it's a paper tube, I like that because then it's just one eye, right? So you have one eye open looking through a tiny window. And like even just taking the tube away, it's still one eye. It's still only half of what you could like possibly see with just your vision.
Right.
And it's still better. You have to be held in a way that you think it's okay to put your arm down,
Yeah, exactly.
Like to the paper towel roll. Like it's not even a nice.
It's actually a toilet paper roll.
It's a toilet paper roll.
Yeah. One ply.
Yeah.
I one of the things that's so tricky, obviously, is trying to put language to a thing that is very nonlinear, non-rational, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like there's such a tendency to assume that the space is there. So when someone comes in and provides conscious holding, conscious space, there's something kind of miraculous about it. Like it defies classical physics, right? It's
even our 3D perception is off too. Like we've talked about that as far as like actually understanding the physical limits around us. So to bring in conscious holding and say there's actually a space totally independent of the physical space that you also misunderstand.
Right.
Is a miraculous thing because it redefines both in the same instant.
Yeah.
We're getting into spacey territory. And then obviously like the evolution of it within the approach is you providing that holding for someone towards the end of them providing it for themselves in a way that they weren't.
Yeah.
We can come back to that, but I think that's kind of like part of the arc of discussing holding in the context of the dimension approach. And that, again, like you said last time, differentiation is still part of the process because that's, again, the fear is that giving space to something that you think is absolute is a threat to, that defense that created it. That letting there be something outside of it is a threat, right? Right. Feels like death, like you're saying. It's like even if you consciously hold something, the awareness is outside of that death threat, right? But it's still very much there, right? At least, I mean, I'm sure that I'm not sure how to say this, but it doesn't make it it doesn't necessarily immediately make it less threatening. It just immediately makes you aware of what the threat was to begin with.
Yes. But to the extent that you realize consciousness as identity, then you recognize that the threat isn't to you.
Yeah.
It's to your body or to your mind or to your something. But it's not to your identity. If we do an experiential thing, if we say that we've been doing a fairly good job of allowing a conscious space for this conversation and allowing a conscious space for both you and I to exist in it and to talk out of our asses about about this stuff, about the universe and space, all that kind of stuff. We've been doing that. We've been throwing around ideas in this conscious space that we're holding. So I'm just going to shift modes. Let's say that we start to get into an argument and then we start shifting from, and I'm not doing it yet, but
I was ready though.
Right. We start getting into an argument about it and then there's potential for the conscious space to go away and it to become more of this ego perception back and forth thing. So let me just try to shift modes. And so what I'm doing is I'm like intentionally closing the window, right, to block out light to a certain part of my mind, changing my focus to much more, to not include you in my consciousness because your mind is dumb and mine's brilliant. So I'm going to...
So why bother interacting?
Right.
It's tough though, because I'm so brilliant. It's hard to, look away.
And it's important to note that we do this in certain dimensions and not others, right? It's the whole point. So I'm going to do it. I'm just going to say, as far as intellect, I've shifted now, and I'm no longer being as consciously open and holding as I was. I'm more just orienting from my intellect, looking at the screen, sort of talking. It feels like more like I want to talk at you than talk with you.
Yeah, it's funny because you seem farther away. Like nothing's changed and you seem farther away.
Yeah, but like you say, there's suddenly like this Z-axis, right? That we're aware of suddenly, of a separateness that we weren't as aware of because we were literally in a different kind of dimensional space. And you feel how from here there isn't, when I'm closing off my intellect like this and interacting with you, our intellects are further apart, like you're saying. There's separateness between them, and I feel a defense, right? Like I feel like I want to keep talking so you can't.
It's almost like being skittish, but like the reaction is to like force something.
Yeah, and I feel a insecurity, right? Like a need to try to validate myself or legitimize myself, or because I can't just rest into some kind of identity or ontology. It feels like I have to keep talking or keep asserting myself in order to keep existing. If I just start to back off for more than a second, I feel like I start to disappear because there's no conscious awareness to rest into. So I literally don't feel as present or as existent. And it's just a state I'm in, but I can feel that these experiences.
Terror.
Yeah, it really is. And it's like, I don't even know what I'm terrified of, except, like I say, kind of,
Silence.
ceasing. Yeah. And this is part of, I think in the modern world, we're really stuck in this to a large degree. And it's like we're thinking our existence, so to speak, even though it's not a real existence.
What do you feel like physically, size-wise, when you're in that mode? Because I think that's something you brought up earlier that is a big part of holding.
Yeah, I feel like a point in space. And I feel like, I feel like a point in threatening space. All right, so I'm going to shift out of it. Of course, I felt very unempathic in that also, right?
Right.
Like empathy just wasn't even, I wasn't refusing empathy. It just like wasn't an option.
Right.
Now I've shifted and I'm holding a conscious space, not only for my own intellect, but even for yours. And I suddenly feel, even though you haven't even said anything yet, I feel connected to you in a way that I didn't a minute ago.
Right. It was like I had to worry about you a minute ago. It's like there was it's like this fear on my end, like something's wrong, like what? And like the longer you were in it, the more and more I felt like just this like rising level of anxiety that something wasn't going to be okay, right? And
yeah.
then the shift to, like you're saying, like taking away, it was almost like you were there, but you were like pushing away really hard.
Yes, right.
Like the how I would describe the Z-axis thing you're talking about, the sense of division between the two of us, like you were like shoving that as much as you could.
Yes. Yeah, now I feel less of that. I feel more receptive. And I don't feel like if I receive you, it's going to snuff me out. Whereas the experience before was like I had to push out, otherwise I'll just...
Right.
And so it's very similar, just like physically. It's like if your dog hops up on your lap, often, the typical response would be this open, receptive, like snuggling. If you're sitting there and suddenly, whatever, some, a rattlesnake suddenly crawls onto your lap, you're going to have a very different response. And people don't tend to think of it this way, but like every energy center is like that, physical, emotional, and mental. So mentally, it's like right now I feel like, okay, there's more of a connection. It's more empathic. There's more of a receptivity. And so it's analogous to like physically if we were, whether it's dancing or wrestling or snuggling and allowing this open kind of back and forth interaction of our bodies, we're doing that with energies in our mind. And there isn't, and there's a trust, just like when, the reason I'm saying like a dog versus a snake, because you trust your dog. You trust that your dog is not gonna, bite your face, right? But you don't necessarily trust that the rattlesnake isn't. And so it's that same kind of thing. It's like, okay, do I need to defend my mind against your mind? Or can I allow this interaction, this back and forth, this connection? Can I allow myself to feel what your mind is feeling, or do I need to defend against that?
Right.
And again, the idea is that obviously there are things we need to defend against. There are threats on various levels. There's actual threats, but then there's all these perceived threats that either aren't really threats or wouldn't be threats if you were anchoring more in consciousness. It's like the idea that, if I call you stupid, at a certain level of self-development and or consciousness, me calling you stupid just kind of goes right through you. You know what I mean? You hear that, but it doesn't mean, well, now you're stupid because you got called stupid.
Right.
The interpretation of it is radically different. And it sounds corny on, just something like being called stupid. But we're all making pretty huge errors with regard to what we think is self and then what we think is a threat to that self. And the more you anchor in consciousness, the more you have a direct realization that, oh, that's not, I don't have to defend against that the way I was defending against it.
Right. That's huge.
So to provide conscious holding, to provide conscious holding for someone else, and of course, it's the same in relation to yourself, but if we say for someone else, let's say for someone else's intellect. I was doing an example of, okay, here's me being in more of a conscious holding state, and then, okay, here's me just coming from intellect and kind of blocking out conscious holding. And then we describe that. How would you describe your experience? Because we were talking about me, right? Right now, I'm saying I'm holding more of a conscious space for your intellect, and before I wasn't. How's it different?
It feels like there's space for, like, your defense triggers a defense for me in a way, in what you were doing before. And it wasn't that I thought you were a threat. It was just like I had to defend against the rising tide of anxiety I felt witnessing your reaction to how you were feeling. When you shift out of that and provide more of a conscious holding space, it feels like things can arise in a way that they couldn't.
Yeah.
Like in a defensive stance, it's like plugging holes in a dam with your fingers. It's like, what do I need to manage so that this doesn't all come tumbling down?
Yeah.
Versus in a conscious holding space, there's a ground that there isn't in that other state.
Right.
And that out of that ground arises whatever arises, but there is you're in a boat instead of like on the other side of a failing dam. That you're just like, you're already in the water, and it's just the water can go up, the water can go down, the water can even get in the boat, but the boat's just a boat. And that's kind of the opportunity of it, to let things come as they will, but not feel like you're actively managing all of it all the time. So maybe that's where the boat metaphor falls apart, but because obviously things can happen to your boat, but the feeling of it in that, of conscious holding versus not providing holding for the intellect, or for not creating a conscious space,
right,
is it feel? I mean, there's a tranquility to it that is definitely not there in the other one, but there's also just, I'm worried more about my personality when you're in that other state too. I'm worried more about, like, I'm not as worried about it in this holding space.
Yeah.
I'm not worried about how I'm perceived in the same way, or how I'm perceiving you in the same way. That I may notice things arise. I may notice some like shift in you. I may notice some physical thing, but it doesn't feel like life or death. And it doesn't feel like, I mean, it sounds cliche, but it just feels like it is what it is in a way that it couldn't in the other state.
Yeah. Yeah. And a couple of important things there. When you're saying that you were affected by me, by what I was doing, that's transference.
Right.
Which is powerful, right? Even when you know it's going on.
Right. Well, it's like I could feel it initially, and then it just kept going, and then it continued after you came out of it. It's almost like there's a delay in it. Like it's like all the information came over here, and it's like, okay, here we go. And then it finally like started to subside, but that continued after you were done,
right,
exhibiting it. Or so that was, I think that happens. And we've talked about this probably like I don't know how long ago it was, but it happens in conversations where it's like you have one conversation and then you're upset about it 3 hours later because that happened. You're not aware of it. And then you're just riding that wave for so long after you actually had that interaction.
And then you want to go find someone else to like dump that.
Obviously. I mean, that's justice, right? Is that how justice works?
Yeah. The transference part of it's important in that, meaning the ego transference, to consciously hold requires empathizing. That's just the nature of it. So, for example, when I was in that state, there was anxiety. Let's say the vibration was anxiety, the vibratory state. And then the question was, okay, can you stay conscious and hold my mind, which also requires you holding your mind, even though it's in this unpleasant state, right?
Right. And
then it sounds like you could feel the tendency to just start defending, right? It was like, well, this doesn't feel good. I'm gonna pull my consciousness off Lance's intellect, or go into a defense in your ego mind,
right?
So that you don't have to experience the unpleasantness. But if you make a conscious decision, okay, there's intense anxiety or whatever it is that's coming from this other person's mind, it's like, okay, I'm going to provide conscious holding and tolerate this unpleasant vibration with this person.
I think it's important how you said that it's still, like you said, requiring empathy. You're doing it with the person. It's just kind of the consciousness versus condescension thing we've talked about before.
Yeah.
That vibration doesn't have to be anything other than what it is.
Right.
That anxiety doesn't have to be something other than anxiety to hold that anxiety is there. And that's fine.
Right.
It's not like, I don't feel anxiety, so I won't, so I'll be here with you in this anxiety. It's like, I know anxiety, and this is anxiety.
Yeah. Yeah, and to just witness it is to just look at it from your conscious mind. But if we say that the conscious mind, this is back to that thing of, okay, instead of the conscious mind just being a headlamp, it's actually, it's like it's this bubble, right? Or let's say it's this sphere. And that sphere can get bigger or smaller, and you can include whatever you want in that sphere, right? You can have the bubble hold, so it's like, all right, you can take your conscious bubble and you can expand it to include my intellect. But when you do that, you're going to feel my intellect, right? You're going to empathically feel it. You're not just going to be looking at it. That's one of the reasons it's like, well, if bringing conscious attention and consciously holding stuff, is so magical and so much better and whatever, it's like, well, why aren't we all just doing that with everything? And it's like, well, because we also have these egos that then have to feel that which we're holding. And it's not our consciousness that feels threatened by that or overwhelmed by that or, just gets too tired. It's like, it's our ego.
Right. You're going to feel your own resistance to that thing.
Yeah.
At least as intensely as that person feels it. Right? Like it's almost compounding when it comes to the ego because it's something the ego didn't want to look at to begin with. You're looking at it in someone else, and then to see that that's also in you.
Right.
Without that's the fatigue you're talking about.
And that also starts to touch on that thing I was bringing up last time about the black nightgown effect.
Mm-hmm.
If we switch places and you're the one doing the just intellect, no conscious holding, right? And so innate to that is the darkness of the ego. So there's this aggression, this hate, this destructiveness, this chaos. And then I'm getting hit with it. But I come out of the ego defense, of my own ego defense, let's say, and I decide I'm going to consciously include what you're doing with your ego right now. Then, like you said, okay, now my ego mind is going to resonate. And in the midst of that, there'd be potential for me to start expressing that outwardly. So instead of sitting here going, oh, fuck, Jeff's like, all this shit's coming at me and I'm holding it, but this is really unpleasant. Instead, I might start to get like this and I might start to get really mad and seem like I'm the source of this fuck you energy.
Right.
And then if you're like, what the fuck's your problem? And I'm like, you're
my problem.
You're my problem. You're just fucking, projecting this fucking ego, whatever, without any conscious holding. And you're like, you're the one throwing a tantrum right now. And this is a phenomenon that occurs.
No, not you are.
Right. And it's terrible, right? There's fights happening all over this planet right as we speak where this is happening. The one person is losing their shit and yelling at the other person, and the other person,
why?
Can't figure out what they did to deserve, or they're thinking what an asshole this person is, or what an anger problem they have.
Right.
And it's like, no, that the person having the blow up sometimes is the person that's actually being more consciously present and is doing more holding of the existent
energy.
Right.
They hit their ego limit.
Yeah. And it's like in those moments, if that's getting too destructive or too dangerous, or, it's like, well, the person needs to back off on their conscious holding, which sucks, but it needs to be done. And generally speaking, you hear about this idea of empaths as far as someone who has a tendency to consciously hold others. And for example, we could say their emotional experience. So I could be an emotional, my default pattern could be to emotionally hold space for whoever I'm interacting with. But then this phenomenon can happen where it's like, I'm overwhelmed by the other person's emotion. And empaths struggle because they're going around holding everyone's stuff and they're getting impacted and it's overwhelming. But then they seem like they have the emotional problem.
Right.
Right? And you could say, well, they do in a certain way, but
just flipped.
Yeah. And it's not that, well, everyone else needs to like clean up their emotional self so that the empath can feel better, because that's not going to happen. It's still on the empath to quit being overly empathic. But again, just as far as kind of trying to describe these relational dynamics that can happen.
Differentiation is key.
Yeah.
If you want to learn more about the Dimension Approach, please visit dimensionapproach.com.